Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, starting out in the Robotyne area where here we have a lot to cover. The Russian forces continue their attempts at counterattacking the direction of Robotyne. So far the main fighting is happening at the south of the village, where the Russian forces are attempting to gain a proper foothold within the village here to the south, ahead of their forward positions and their main defensive line here to the south of the Robotyne. We also see them fighting over the defensive lines and trenches here to the west of Robotyne, while the Ukrainian forces have managed to advance here to the east of Robotyne, as well as to the southeast of Robotyne in the direction of Kupyansk, as well as Russia's main line of defense. So what we're seeing here is that the Russian forces are trying to regain control over Robotyne, while the Ukrainian forces are continuing their attacks in the direction of the main line of defense of the Russian forces. And we also see them attack in the Russian positions to the west of Robotyne. So the Ukrainian objective here is to keep their hold on Robotyne and meanwhile attack the direction of the main line of defense of the Russian forces and try to go around the rest of Robotyne in the direction of Kupyansk. This way they will avoid the trenches to the south of Robotyne, and at the same time, with their hold of the central and northern parts of Robotyne, they're able to conduct these operations to the east while avoiding direct fire from the Russian forces. If the Russian forces manage to recapture Robotyne, which is what they're doing with their counterattacks to the south of the village, they would be able to then restart their direct fire on the Ukrainian positions, or even go around and cut off the Ukrainian forces. But what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces push down south to try and cut off the Russian forces from the road here in the north of Novopokrovka. If the Ukrainian forces manage to capture Novopokrovka, they'll be able to cut off the supplies to the Russian forces by the trenches to the south of Robotyne, and as such force them to either withdraw or cut them off completely and allowing them to attack the Russian positions and defeating them without fighting them by just waiting out their supplies. So the actions we're seeing from each side, for the Ukrainian side, they are consolidating their forces in Robotyne and they are trying to gather enough forces to eventually capture the defensive positions to the west and east of Robotyne before moving down to the southern trenches of Robotyne. Meanwhile, the Russian forces are gaining and sending reinforcements to the area to try and push the Ukrainians back. Meanwhile, they also have an air force that constantly drops 500 bombs against the Ukrainian forces within the village and around it. And we also see the Russian forces constantly shell the Ukrainian positions, and the Ukrainians are heavily shelling the Russian positions as well. So the Ukrainian forces are here not as fortified as the Russians are, as the Ukrainians are moving through the areas where they have been fighting through at positions, waiting for the Ukrainians to advance. Now they have started their own counterattacks, which will naturally increase the Russian losses as well. Then we move on to the Vremivka ledge area, where here we see the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks and have moved them to the eastern parts of Robotyne. Here the Ukrainian forces try to push the main defensive line. This allows the Ukrainian forces to then push on heavily, but so far they've been unable to push the Russian forces out of their forward positions to the east of Robotyne. Then we move on to the Vremivka area, where here to the north of Vremivka, recent footage showcases a Russian drone hitting Ukrainian forces here by the forest line, which indicates that they have managed to reach the Russian positions here. And I have then moved the gray zone slightly to showcase this change in territory. And then we move on to the Klishchiivka area, where here there is this footage here which was shared by a deep state map which showcases some Ukrainian Klishchiivka area. Then we move on to the north by the Kharkiv-Luhansk areas, where here fighting continues and the Russian forces continue their attempts at attacking Klishchiivka. They are attacking from two directions, from the north and from the east, as they try to gain control over the village. The issue for the Russian forces is that the Ukrainians are still holding the forest areas here to the south and to the west of Klishchiivka, and there's heavy artillery battles going on between the two sides. However, due to the a high level of forest density here in the area. It is difficult for the Russian forces to detect the Ukrainian artillery, so it's taken them a very long time to push them away from the area. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian forces are constantly shelling the Russian positions back. And neither side has taken positions in Klishchiivka, as the area is so out in the open in comparison to the forest areas that neither side is willing to expose themselves by going inside the village. Then we move back to the Robotyne area, where here there's been a lot of news about the Ukrainian capture of Robotyne. So with the Ukrainian capture of Robotyne, as I've mentioned multiple times in previous analysis, this allows the Ukrainians to start their main push against the Russian main defensive line. This is this line right here. So the Ukrainians now are able to launch their attacks against it. As we can see, they have their front line essentially mashed up against the Russian main defensive line. They can start attacking it if they want to. What they're currently doing is that they're trying to capture Kupyansk as well, which will allow them to attack on a wider front. The Russian forces currently have about 40,000 soldiers between Vremivka and Kupyansk. So this area here, they have 40,000 troops. In comparison, the Ukrainians have 60,000, which is a 1.5 advantage. This is the estimates based on official numbers. So the Ukrainian forces here are trying to attack on a wider front to make use of the numerical superiority, and at the same time they want to concentrate their forces through one of the areas in this wide front to then allow them to break through. So the wider the front is, the more possibilities there is for them to concentrate their forces in one area and then break through. Because if the Russian forces have to spread their forces across the whole line, then they are unable to concentrate their forces in one place. In comparison, if the Ukrainians just launched the attack now, the Russian forces would have much less area to actually defend in comparison. So the wider the area the Russians have to defend, the easier it is for the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces and break through. That is why they're going for Kupyansk. It will allow them to extend the front line significantly in comparison, especially if they also get to go around the defenses at Kupyansk and Rivne, which would then allow the Russian forces to then be pushed out of the areas. However, we do see that the Russian forces anticipated this when they built their fortifications and have fortifications to the south of Rivne and to the north of Kupyansk. This means that the Ukrainian forces' best possibility of actually attacking these positions would be to go sideline. However, this would also be exposing the Ukrainians for attacks and fire from two directions, from the south and from the north. So even that is difficult for the Ukrainian forces. So most likely they will stick with Klishchiivka to Vremivka in this area. Now, since the start of the offensive in this direction, Robotyne is the only village the fighting has taken place at, and with the Ukrainian capture of it after 3 months of fighting, the Western media has been very ecstatic about it. They say that this is a major step for Ukraine to capture Tokmak, and that with this, the Ukrainian forces are now very close to capturing Tokmak. The worst is over. It will only become easier from here on out. Sure, there is a lot of fortifications all throughout this whole area. The main issue with that analysis is that these fortifications are spread about. It is not one straight line. In comparison, this one is one straight line. The Russian forces are able to hold their positions across the whole area, and if the Ukrainians manage to break through in one area, then the Russians can send reinforcements from the other areas. In comparison, with the Russians' positions ahead of this being spread out, the Ukrainians can just attack them one at a time. If the Russians decide to send reinforcements from one of the other areas, they'll be exposed for another attack from a different direction. So this was a possibility that wasn't available for them at that time. And generally, the fortifications here by the main defensive line are at a whole nother level compared to the forward positions, with anti-tank trench ditches and dragon teeth and so on. Heavy fortifications by the Russian forces, not to mention that although there was 5-kilometer long minefields to the north of Robotyne, there is still minefields ahead of these fortifications, and the Russians can launch further mines with their artillery. So there definitely no shortage of mines here either, so there is only more difficulties with this. The Western argument is that with the fighting that has taken place to the north of the main defensive line, the Russian attrition would cut down the amount of Russian soldiers to the point that they cannot fully man this main fortification, and this is why it will be easier for Ukraine to break through, and it will be easier for them here on out. But this is a assumption based on no evidence, as there is no evidence to high Russian losses throughout this offensive. There is a lot more evidence of high Ukrainian losses throughout this offensive, which in the end would make it more difficult, not less difficult, for the Ukrainian forces to break through Russia's main defensive line. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.